this is Matt at LSAT Lab. Today's lesson is about how to master the logical reasoning section. So in today's lesson, I want to cover a few things. First, we want to cover an overview of what the logical reasoning section entails, what the questions within that section look like, what the test writers use to make them more or less difficult, and then talk about some of the things that you're going to want to learn so that you can figure out ways to improve your score. So the logical reasoning section, remember, 2 of the 4 sections on the LSAT, 2 of the 4 scored sections on the LSAT are logical reasoning. There are 24 to 26 questions in each of these sections with only 35 minutes, meaning you're not going to feel like you have enough time to complete them. But it's 50% of your total LSAT score. So any improvement you make in logical reasoning pays off twofold compared to either reading comprehension or logic games. It's a really important subject to conquer. The question types within the logical reasoning section can be lumped together in these larger families. And essentially there are 3 families of question types. And the largest is the assumption family. The assumption family essentially are questions where you're being asked to evaluate arguments. The right answer, whether you're being asked to strengthen the argument or weaken the argument or describe the error of reasoning within the argument or find an assumption of the argument, it's always about you finding the gap within the reasoning. The inference family is the next biggest family, and 24% of all questions belong to this family. The inference family is described as one where the questions are asking you to, they're going to give you some information, and the question will ask you to figure out what you know based off of that information. So either what must be true, or what must be false, or what is most supported by the information. But essentially, the right answer will follow from the information presented, and there won't necessarily be an argument inside of the stimulus, inside of that initial paragraph. So it's more of an extrapolation from the information than having an impact on the argument. And the function family makes up the smallest family of question types. It's only 19% of all questions belong to this family. And what makes these questions different is that what they're asking you to do is to figure out how the argument works. Either they're asking you to describe the method of reasoning employed, or what the role is of a particular claim with the argument, or even what's the main idea of the argument. But it's more about your ability to break down the different pieces of the argument, figure out what their role is or their function is within that argument, and then to be able to describe how they relate together. So if we look at each of these families and their individual question types, 64% of all questions belong to the assumption family, with necessary assumption at 11% and flaw at 16%. So some of the biggest question types out there belong within the assumption family. Within the inference family, 17% of all questions belong to that family, must be true and most supported play major roles. And within the function family, the questions that ask you to either describe the method of reasoning or find the main point or parallel the reasoning are the major players there. So there are a total of 17 different question types within the logical reasoning section. Each one is going to have its own little nuances, its own little particularities, and it's important that you learn how to play within those individual frameworks so that when you get lost, which occasionally might happen, you have a reference for how to move forward. So here's a real LSAT question. And while we're not going to actually try to attempt this question, I want to use it just to show you or highlight the different pieces of a logical reasoning question. So that initial paragraph is what we call the stimulus. It's either a set of facts or an argument. Generally speaking, for the vast majority of questions, it's going to be an argument. And for a vast majority of those questions, it's going to be a bad argument, and one in which the conclusion does not follow from the evidence. And your primary objective is to figure out what it is that they're trying to prove, what's the basis upon which that claim is made, and why doesn't that conclusion follow? So what's the gap between what they've established and what they're trying to prove? The question stem sets out your task. So whether you're trying to strengthen the argument or weaken the argument or find the assumption of the argument, there's a lot of different ways in which you can approach that gap, either by pointing it out or fixing it. And so there's a variety of question types that are essentially all pointing at the same thing. Can you figure out what's wrong with this argument? And that's why whether you want to read the question stem first because you like to know what your task is, or you want to read the stimulus first because you basically know what it is that you're looking for, which is essentially to evaluate that argument that's sitting there. and like to have an unbiased opinion before you go on to the rest of the question, it really doesn't matter. I'm fine with either way. I think there's a huge discussion within the LSAT community about whether to read the question stem first or whether to read the stimulus first. My vote on that debate is that it doesn't matter. That it's better for some people to do it one way and better for other people to do it another way. There's no one size fits all answer to this hotly debated question within the LSAT community. And then finally, there's the answer choices, and each one of them is very carefully constructed. And so we're going to take a closer look at how they're organizing these and what they're doing in order to create tempting but wrong situations, and how often they want to do that and when they want to do that. So if we talk about the difficulty level of a logical reasoning section as we move from question 1 to question 25, generally speaking, as you move deeper into the section, the questions get harder. Now, that's not universally true. There might be a question or two at the very end of the section that actually gets a little easier, and you might run into a doozy at question number 6. But generally speaking, the section is going to get more and more challenging as you move through it. And essentially, you can kind of break the section into thirds. A good approach for that first third is to rely on your intuition, because your intuition is the best force. It's the most efficient tool for working through that information. The topics of the questions will be ones that you can relate to, and you'll have an intuitive sense of what would be wrong with this thing and what you're looking for in the answer choices. So you don't want to overthink the earlier part of the section. It's important to recognize that some of the questions are going to be harder than others, and to treat the easier questions with less respect and spend less time there. So when you read the argument, you want to use your intuition to understand what's wrong with it, and then look in the answer choices for that intuitive response to what's wrong. This won't be true for everybody, but this is true for a very large number of people. The majority of test takers should find that first third is fairly intuitive. Remember, they need questions that can distinguish somebody in the 160s from somebody who's in the 170s, right? That's going to be a question that's going to be on the harder end of the spectrum. But they also need questions that can distinguish somebody in the 120s from somebody who's in the 130s. So they actually do need a minimum number of easier questions, ones that you'll probably find fairly straightforward, and you should be expecting them earlier in the section. As you move into the middle part of the section, what you're going to find is that the arguments themselves are still fairly intuitive. But when you get to the answer choices, you're going to find yourself hemming and hawing between two much more often. So essentially what they're doing is they're building in these answer choices that are tempting, very, very tempting, even though they're wrong. And they're doing this on questions where your intuition can still be the primary driver of how you understand the information that's being processed. So to take a closer look at these trap answers, so remember, each of these questions has 5 answer choices, A, B, C, D, and E. It's true every single question. So when you work through those answer choices, a very common response, especially when you get to that middle third of the section, is that as you work through them, you'll find an answer choice that you like. You'll be able to eliminate other answer choices. Maybe you find another one that you like. You keep eliminating answer choices. And you'll use your intuition to understand that B is simply just not relevant to the argument, or that D is like the backwards of what you're looking for, right? So you can generally get a pretty good sense of which answer choices are the best contenders, especially in that middle section, off of an intuitive approach. But to get past those two tempting answer choices, to figure out which one is actually the right answer, may involve some process. So the process is, for each of those question types that we looked at earlier, they have a slightly different set of characteristics, different kinds of reasons why an answer choice could be wrong. So for example, if you're looking for a necessary assumption, an answer choice that would be right on a necessary assumption would be something that doesn't go beyond what the argument needed to assume. And strength would be potentially problematic on a necessary assumption question. But on a strengthened question, the stronger the answer is, the better it is. So strength could never be a reason why an answer choice would be wrong on a strengthened question. And if you can learn what these different characteristics of what's good and what's bad within each of the individual question type, you can build these trap answer patterns. And so maybe what you notice is that when you look at A and C, the only difference between them is these little language cues. So for example, in A, it uses the word if, and in C, it uses the words only if, but otherwise, the answer choices are essentially identical. In that case, those language cues mean very different things. If means sufficiency, only if means necessity. And so what these are both doing is establishing if-then relationships, if A, then B, but the language and the order in which they're being constructed is in reverse of each other. Whatever comes after the word if is on the trigger side of an if-then relationship. Whatever comes after only if is on the outcome side of an if-then relationship. So these answer choices are literally the reverse of each other. And maybe based off of that, you're able to figure out that C is the reverse of what you're looking for. Answer choice A is the right answer. You mark it and move on. So you're essentially using language cues to identify different kinds of tricks that they might use in order to create trap answers. So the wrong answer choices have one or more specifically designed reasons why they are wrong. And some of those answer choices, some of those reasons why they're wrong are fairly obvious, like the thing is just not relevant to the argument. It's out of scope, or it's doing the exact opposite of what you're looking for. But some of them are a little less obvious. And if you can learn the different trap answer patterns that are appropriate for each of the questions, which we cover in this course, then you'll be armed when you get torn between two answer choices to tick through a Rolodex of 5 or 6 different things that you know are the most common issues so that you can spot them. It's much more accurate to find the wrong answer when you're down to 2 than it is to find the right answer when you're down to 2, because you can generally always talk yourself into an answer choice that looks good. But to figure out why it's wrong requires that you identify something specific. So here are some of the common trap answers related to, you can take all of the different trap answer patterns and bucket them into 3 major categories. Those that are related to scope, so answer choices that might be out of scope or only halfway related. Maybe if you're trying to resolve, if you're trying to describe what's a dispute between 2 people, maybe one person addresses it but the other person doesn't, so it might be just half scope. Or you have a relationship where you're using the wrong trigger, you're landing on the wrong outcome, or something is speculating about the future when you have no idea about it. Or there's a term shift where they use a key term with slightly different language such that it's no longer exactly the right idea. Then there's issues related to logic. So that's the more of the impact in terms of the argument and why or why not it's going to work. So for example, a premise support would be an idea that would support a premise in an argument. And if you're on a strengthening question, if you're trying to support a premise, you're not making the argument any better because we've already assumed that evidence was true. Or if you're trying to build a relationship between 2 ideas, if an answer choice reverses that relationship or negates that relationship, these are issues of logic that relate back to why the answer is wrong. There's a whole bunch more. I'm not going to go through each of those. But issues related to degree, answer choices that are too strong or too weak or too narrow. These would be specific reasons why an answer choice could potentially be wrong. And you generally want to work through these trap answer patterns in this order. So from issues of scope through issues of logic to issues of degree, because there are more and more subtle reasons, or each one is one level up in terms of subtlety, in terms of why the answer choice is wrong. If you start going and eliminating answer choices based off of degree, you can generally make more errors than you're resolving. So with these trap answer patterns, it's better to start with scope, work through logic, and then finish with degree. So what makes a hard question hard? Beyond just trap answers, which you will have to deal with, you also are going to deal with just confusing language within the arguments. You're going to have a harder and a harder time understanding the actual arguments that you're reading. They're going to go from talking about car sales within a particular city, which most people can understand and relate to things like tracheophytes and chordates, things that most people have never even heard of. So as they change the subject matter from things that you're familiar with to things that you're not familiar with, they're removing your ability to use intuition to understand the argument clearly. And that's when you're going to need to start relying on reasoning and the structures that are embedded within these arguments to have a better understanding of what's going on. So there are 3 main reasoning structures that these arguments are built on. These arguments and these sets of facts, generally speaking. So comparison is a reasoning structure that's involved in 65% of all logical reasoning questions. So an example of a comparison would be something like they're telling you about medication X and medication Y, and they tell you that medication X is more effective at treating some disease than medication Y. So now they're comparing 2 different things at a point in time, and they're comparing their effectiveness in treating some disease. Another variation on a comparison might be something along the lines of medication X today and the effectiveness of medication X today and the effectiveness of medication X 10 years ago. Maybe they've changed the recipe over time or something. But if they may also be comparing one thing over two different time periods. So two things at one time or one thing over two different periods of time. But these comparisons are very common. And oftentimes it boils down to a pros and cons list. Maybe they tell you that medication X is more effective at treating some disease than medication Y. So therefore, we should go ahead and use medication X, without considering that there may be other factors that might be relevant in what we decide to use. Maybe there are side effects associated with medication X that are just so unbearable, they wouldn't wish them on anybody. And so even though medication Y is not as effective as medication X, even though it's pretty close, maybe, it may be a lot better of a choice because of all the lack of negatives that would also be associated with medication X. Another reasoning structure is conditional logic. And in a lot of ways, this is the backbone of the LSAT. 54% of logical reasoning questions involve conditional logic, and a lot of games involve conditional logic. So it's a major player in 3 of the 4 sections. Conditional logic are these if-then relationships, something like if A, then B, if B, then C, therefore if A, then C. That's called a syllogism. This stuff goes all the way back to Aristotle. He created conditional logic as we know it. It's usually taught in an intro to logic philosophy course. Or in mathematics, if you're working through a major in mathematics, generally speaking, they make you take something called proofs at some point. And proofs is essentially building arguments using conditional relationships, if-then ideas, in order to prove theorems or whatever it is that they're proving. So you want to understand how these if-then relationships work. If you took an intro to logic course in college, that's fantastic. That's going to serve you well. You're probably not going to need all of that information in order to be able to handle these conditional relationships. If you haven't, don't worry. You can learn it pretty quickly. It generally takes a couple of weeks. It's not a good idea to go get your hands on a copy of a intro to logic textbook, because there's simply way more that's covered in one of those books than is used on the LSAT, and it's just not worth your time. And conditional logic is something that you can relatively easily learn over a short period of time. Causation is another major reasoning structure on the LSAT. If you think about to like the social sciences, one of the things that people are constantly on the lookout for is mistaking a correlation in data for a causal relationship. And the LSAT measures your ability to spot the difference between the two. So just because A and B happened at the same time doesn't mean that A caused B to occur. If you're asked to weaken an argument where they asserted that A did cause B, you might find an alternative cause, or show an example where the cause happened but the effect didn't, and so on and so forth. And so you're either going to be trying to strengthen the correlation between these supposedly causally related ideas, or maybe trying to weaken the argument by finding alternative causes or alternative explanations. But causation is another major role player in reasoning structures, and it's important to learn what language cues imply a causal relationship, and then how to address it within each of the different question types that play with it. So that's how they make questions harder as you move through the logical reasoning section. You want to be on the lookout for using the right approach at the right time. If you take an approach that is overly process-driven, that would be appropriate for a harder part of the section, and use it at the easier part of the section, you're going to find that it leads to second guessing, and it slows you way down and is not very effective. But if you try to use that completely intuitive approach later in the section, there are some people who are so brilliant for whom the whole test is intuitive, and that's fantastic for them, but that's just so few individuals. You want to be on the lookout for the appropriate place to adjust the way you're thinking according to how difficult you're finding these questions to be. Remember, so how to master logical reasoning, the key to mastering logical reasoning is to simply be aware of both trap answer patterns and how to use them to make eliminations as you work through the answer choices, and the reasoning structures that allow you to better perceive the gap in these arguments in the first place. So that's it for how to master the logical reasoning section. I invite you to check out some of these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.